They didn't steal from me overnight. No, my downfall was a slow bleed, masked with smiles, masked with for your own good, and we're just helping. I was Eleanor Voss, matriarch of the Voss name, owner of the Waverly estate, a woman whose signature once opened doors across the city. Now, I'm a footnote in my own legacy. Cast out, mocked, publicly shamed by the very people I gave everything to. My children didn't just betray me, they dismantled me. But what they never understood is that ashes aren't the end of a fire. Sometimes, they're where it begins. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Eleanor Voss, a woman devoured by her own bloodline, stripped of wealth, dignity, and respect. But this isn't just a tragedy. It's a reckoning wrapped in secrets and revenge served through whispers and silence. Eleanor Voss had built the family fortune from a crumbling inheritance. The house on Waverly Hill, 5 stories of oak, glass, and pride, had once been her grandfather's. She restored it, raised 3 children within its walls, buried her husband in the garden overlooking the sea. Everything she was, everything she had, flowed into that home. But time has a cruel way of turning love into entitlement. Her eldest, Harrison, used charm like a scalpel. "Let me handle the paperwork, Mum. You've done enough." The second, Julia, played the concerned daughter. "We need to get your affairs in order while you're still sharp." And the youngest, Ben, had always been the manipulator in sheep's clothing. "I just want you to be comfortable." Bit by bit, they chipped away at her rights, power of attorney, estate access, company shares. The documents were prepared, just in case, the decisions for her protection. Then came the announcement, the Voss Foundation Gala, held at Waverly Hall. Eleanor's face wasn't on the invitation. "I thought this was my event," she asked Julia. "You're retired," Julia smiled, applying lipstick in Eleanor's mirror. "This is a new era." When Eleanor arrived at the gala, her name wasn't on the guest list. Her portrait, once hanging above the grand fireplace, had been removed. In its place, a modern family painting, her 3 children in designer suits, holding champagne with the estate in the background. She wasn't in it. And then came the final wound. On stage, Harrison presented a donation from the Voss siblings to a local museum. It included the family heirlooms, jewels, letters, even her husband's watch. "To preserve history," he said. "From our late mother's collection." Late. She stood up. The room turned. Silence fell. "I am not dead," she said, trembling. Laughter followed. A man in the crowd whispered, "Someone should have brought her nurse." Another, "They really should have kept her home." Julia stepped forward and gently took the microphone. "I'm so sorry. Mother has been confused lately." They ushered her out, escorted like an intruder in her own home. That night, Eleanor slept in a motel. The next morning, the locks were changed. The motel had no name on the sign, just flickering red letters that once spelled vacancy, now cracked and half-lit like a wound in neon. Eleanor Voss sat upright on the edge of a stiff mattress, staring into the stale air. It was morning, or maybe late afternoon. The closed curtains bled in a dim orange light that made it hard to tell. The thin floral blanket barely covered her knees, and her slippers were still damp from the night before. The woman in the mirror didn't look like the one who had once hosted diplomats, scholars, and gallery owners in the drawing room of Waverly Hill. This woman looked like the forgotten. But Eleanor wasn't confused. She hadn't forgotten. Every word, every false smile at the gala, every whisper behind her back, every time Julia gently steered her away from a conversation, as if she were a child wandering into traffic, it was all there. Filed neatly in her mind like pages in the thick ledgers her husband used to keep. They had taken everything. The estate, the company, her reputation, her place in society. And last night, they took her dignity, publicly. She recalled the sound of clinking glasses, The laughter that bubbled like acid when she interrupted Harrison's speech and declared she wasn't dead. The look in his eyes, the same look he had as a boy when he caught a rabbit in the garden and broke its leg just to see what it would do. What had she created? No, that wasn't right. What had she enabled? A low buzz came from the mini fridge in the corner. The motel room offered no tea, just a bitter instant coffee powder packet folded between a styrofoam cup and a single wooden stir stick. She brewed it anyway, each movement deliberate, almost ritualistic. The sharp smell brought her back to mornings in the Waverly kitchen. Her housekeeper, Melba, had always made it just right. Not too strong, not too sweet. Melba was gone now. Retired, they said. Sent off quietly, with a severance and a non-disclosure agreement. Eleanor hadn't even known until weeks later. She wrapped the robe tighter around her chest and paced. The floor creaked beneath the faded carpet. Her bag, small and black, sat on the table. Inside was her ID, a few $100s, and a silver key to a door that no longer existed. Her phone had been locked for her safety, Julia's words. And Eleanor's online access to the family trust had been temporarily suspended. Peter had done that. He had a knack for hiding behind protocol. She stood by the window and peeled the curtain back slightly. A couple in their 20s were dragging their luggage out of the room next door. He wore a hoodie. She wore headphones. Neither of them noticed her. That invisibility stung more than it should have. She sat down again, but this time, her fingers moved with purpose. She pulled out a tattered leather notebook from the bottom of her handbag. Its edges were curled and dry, the paper inside yellowed with time. It was her ledger, not of finances, but of truths. The things no one else had thought to record. She flipped to a page titled, Contingency, 1993. Back then, she had added a legal clause to the estate transfer, following a bitter legal fight with Thomas's half-brother over a parcel of family land. She'd had it inserted quietly under advisement from Dr. Sabine Alder, a family friend and legal scholar, into the Waverly property deed. If Eleanor were ever to be declared dead or mentally unfit, the estate ownership would trigger an independent review, one that could not be overridden without her direct signature. She had never told her children. Why would she? Back then, Harrison was still in school. Julia still painted. And Ben still brought her wildflowers from the garden and called her Queen Mother. She ran her finger over Sabine's name. They hadn't spoken in nearly a decade. Last Eleanor heard, Sabine had retired to the coast, living quietly in a wind-battered house where the sea met the cliffs. But Sabine didn't forget things. And if that clause still stood, if it hadn't been found and buried by the vultures her children had become, then there was still something left to fight for. And this time, she would not beg to be seen. Eleanor folded the notebook closed and stood up. She smoothed her hair in the mirror, adjusted her collar, and looked herself dead in the eyes. "You're not dead yet," she whispered. "And you're not finished." She checked out of the motel by noon. She didn't leave a tip. She didn't look back. The bus station wasn't far. The next route left at 1:15. She bought her ticket in cash and sat on the plastic bench beside a boy with a skateboard and a woman holding a baby wrapped in a green blanket. When the bus pulled up, Eleanor climbed the steps slowly. Not because she was frail, but because it felt like crossing a threshold. From this moment on, she would not be the quiet matriarch. She would be the storm that her children never saw coming. The sea was loud here. Not the peaceful kind of loud that accompanied summer waves brushing sand, but the angry roar of cliffs battered by wind and salt. It was the kind of place that refused to be tamed, where the weather changed on a whim and the skies held grudges. Eleanor stood on the edge of the stone path leading to the cottage, a modest, slate-roofed house nestled into the hillside. It looked smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she'd simply grown used to houses that screamed status. This one whispered safety. A gull cried overhead. She tightened her scarf against the coastal wind and stepped forward. The door was still painted blue, Sabine's favorite color. A small, rusted bell hung beside it. Eleanor raised her hand to knock, but her fingers hesitated midair. What if Sabine didn't remember? What if she'd moved on from everything: the law, the past, the people who only resurfaced when they needed something? But she knocked anyway. It took nearly a minute before the door creaked open. There she was. Sabine Alder looked older. Yes, her silver hair tied in a bun, her face lined like worn parchment, but her eyes hadn't changed. Still sharp, still wary, still capable of seeing through the carefully folded layers people wore. "Eleanor," Sabine said, her voice low and flat. "God help me, I thought I'd buried you already." "Not yet," Eleanor replied, managing a smile. "But they tried." Sabine studied her for a beat, then stepped aside. "Come in. You look like hell." Inside, the cottage smelled of chamomile and firewood. Books lined the walls, stacks upon stacks, like towers built by a mind that refused to settle. A kettle hissed softly in the background. They sat across from one another in worn armchairs. A storm began outside, quiet at first, like footsteps on the roof. "They took the house," Eleanor said. "And everything with it. My name, my accounts, my voice. They declared me senile in public. Harrison gave a speech about my legacy. Julia patted my hand like I was fading." Sabine leaned back. "So why now? Why come to me after all this time?" Eleanor reached into her coat and drew out the folded document, the 1993 amendment. She placed it gently on the table between them, as if offering a forgotten truth. "I need to know if this still holds," she said. Sabine didn't touch it at first. She read it from above, her eyes narrowing. "This was notarized, with my old seal. I remember this. You made me draft it after that disaster with Thomas's brother." "I never told the children it existed," Eleanor said. "They think they've won, that the estate is theirs." Sabine finally picked up the paper, running her fingers over the ink. "This clause activates full review by an independent trustee, in this case, me, if you're declared legally dead or unfit. You're neither. Which means this house they've stolen from under you might not be theirs at all." Eleanor leaned in. "Can it be undone?" Sabine's eyes met hers. "It can be questioned. Legally. If we proceed, the court can challenge the validity of their actions. But it won't be pretty. They'll fight it. They'll try to paint you as delusional." Eleanor exhaled. "They already have." Silence passed between them like a shared wound. Sabine's voice softened. "You sure you want to drag your name through all this? There won't be any grace left when it's over. Just bones and dust." Eleanor's fingers curled over the armrest. "Grace is a luxury for women who still have their names. I lost mine when they put me on that stage and told the world I was dead." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the rain came harder, slanting sideways across the windows. Sabine nodded slowly, reached for a legal pad on the side table, and clicked her pen. "Then let's dig them up. One secret at a time." 14 years had passed since Eleanor Voss last penned a letter by hand with real purpose. Not a holiday card, not a thank you note or condolence message, but a letter that breathed with intent. She sat by the window in Sabine's cottage, the wind rattling against the glass, and dipped her pen into ink like a general sharpening a blade. Her children had always believed themselves clever, but none of them had inherited her patience. They knew how to seize, how to manipulate, but not how to endure. She did. With Sabine's help, they had spent the past 4 days combing through old records, bank statements, corporate filings, and property transfers. They'd unearthed a quiet trail of fraud, dates that didn't match, signatures that wavered. A forged document here, an unauthorized withdrawal there. All of it subtle, expertly buried, but to Eleanor, each piece was a footprint leading deeper into the betrayal. It wasn't enough to reveal the truth. Not yet. No, the Voss children needed to come to her. And so, she began to write. "To my beloved children, I write not out of grief, but from a place of great clarity. I have come into possession of certain documents regarding the estate, and matters regarding inheritance and legal ownership must be addressed. I am hosting a dinner this Sunday, 7 p.m. at Waverly Hill. Yes, the house. Our house. I expect all three of you to attend. This is not a request. There are matters to be settled before the dust can truly rest. And you deserve to hear them from my lips, not from a court summons. Yours, Mother. She signed each one slowly, pressing her name into the paper as if to reclaim it from the void. Eleanor Voss. Sabine reviewed each letter with her usual keen eye, then folded them crisply and sealed them in envelopes embossed with the old family crest, something Julia had dismissed years ago as gauche. They won't come if they smell a trap, Sabine warned. They won't come because they care, Eleanor replied. They'll come because they think there's something left to steal. She didn't trust couriers or email. She mailed the letters herself at a small post office 20 miles inland, where no one would think to look. It was a symbolic gesture, yes, but it was also strategic. It made the message feel more final, more serious. She returned to Waverly Hill at dusk the next day. The house had changed in her absence, not structurally, but spiritually. The warmth was gone. The hallways were cold. The smell of fresh flowers had been replaced with sterile polish and designer fragrances. But the walls remembered her. So did the creaking steps, the hidden cabinet in the study where Thomas once kept his ledgers, and the cellar door that only opened with the weight of her hand pressing just right. She walked room by room like a ghost reclaiming her body. In the drawing room, she paused by the fireplace. The grand portrait that had once hung there, her and Thomas on their wedding day, was gone, replaced by some abstract monstrosity Julia had commissioned. She made a note to burn it. Then she ascended the stairs. The master bedroom had been stripped of anything that felt like her. New sheets. New rug. But her vanity table remained in the corner. They had forgotten to remove it. Or maybe they didn't notice it was hers. She opened the drawer. Inside, a silver locket. She had given it to Julia when she turned 16. Julia had returned it to her during a fight they never spoke of again. Eleanor held it now, her reflection barely visible in the tarnished surface. They forgot who you were, she whispered to herself. Time to remind them. The following day, the replies came, text messages, of course. Modern efficiency wrapped in politeness. Harrison, understood. See you Sunday, Mother. Julia, I assume this is regarding the trust. I'll be there. On time. Ben, curious. But if it's food and business, count me in. They were coming. Not out of love. Not even out of fear. But because they thought they were still in control. Eleanor knew better. She walked through the dining hall that evening, tracing her fingers along the long oak table where Sunday dinners used to stretch into twilight. She could still hear the echoes, the laughter, the lies, the small betrayals tucked between courses. And now it would host one final meal, one that none of them would forget. The chandeliers had been cleaned. It was the first thing Eleanor noticed as she stood in the foyer of Waverly Hill, her reflection fracturing across the cut crystal prisms above. Someone had taken the time, perhaps Julia or one of her hired decorators, to polish away the dust and fingerprints. But not the history. History had a way of clinging to things like smoke in old drapes. You could change the furniture, repaint the walls, gut the hearth, but a house knew who it belonged to. And tonight, it belonged to her again. Sabine had arrived hours earlier, dressed in neutral colors and carrying a black briefcase she refused to put down. She remained quiet, observing the estate like a scientist entering a preserved ruin. Together, she and Eleanor had set the table not with caterers or staff, but with their own hands. Silver polished, wine chilled, no detail missed. A false comfort, just enough to keep the air from crackling too early. At exactly 6:57 p.m., the sound of tires on gravel echoed through the long drive. Eleanor didn't move. Let them come to her. The first to arrive was Harrison. Tall, polished, draped in arrogance as always. He entered without knocking, still using the key he'd awarded himself last year. He paused when he saw her, truly saw her, standing there, upright and composed in a deep navy dress, her hair neatly pinned, her expression unreadable. "Mother," he said, carefully, "you look well." She gave a thin smile. Resurrection tends to do that to a woman. His lips twitched, but he said nothing. Julia followed minutes later, her heels clicking like hammers against the floor. She wore a modern, sculpted coat, hair swept into a professional bun. She glanced around the foyer, visibly displeased with the decor. Her eyes landed on Eleanor with a flicker of hesitation, one quickly buried beneath condescension. "Well," she said, "this is dramatic." "No more than being declared dead at a gala," Eleanor replied calmly. Julia bit the inside of her cheek but said nothing more. Ben was last, as always. A little unshaven, wearing a half-ironed shirt under a sport coat. He gave Eleanor a nod and a half-smile as if this were a casual dinner among equals. "Glad to see you vertical," he said. "Didn't expect that." Eleanor turned to lead them into the dining room without answering. Let them stew in their discomfort. Let the silence grow. The room had been set meticulously, 6 chairs, though only 5 were occupied. The 6th remained at the far end of the table. Eleanor's seat. Sabine stood in the corner, offering no greeting, just a quiet nod. The children took their places, hands on their laps, expressions tight. A candle flickered in the center of the table, casting long shadows against the white walls. The air was heavy with expectation. The walls, once lined with family portraits, were bare. Ben poured himself a glass of wine. "So," he said, raising his glass to no one, "shall we address the elephant?" Eleanor met his gaze. "The elephant," she echoed, "has already been seated. I suggest you show it some respect." Julia crossed her arms. "Is this about inheritance? Or are you trying to get back at us for what?" Eleanor's voice sliced through the air. "For publicly pronouncing my death? For locking me out of my own accounts? For humiliating me in front of the foundation I built with your father?" The room stiffened. Harrison cleared his throat. "Mother, we've been over this. You weren't well. You were confused." "No, Harrison," she said, her voice steady. "I was inconvenient." "And what does your generation do with the inconvenient? You silence it. You dress it up as compassion and erase it." Sabine stepped forward now, finally speaking. "I am Dr. Sabine Alder," she said. "I have been appointed, by a legally binding document drafted in 1993, as an independent trustee to oversee the Waverly estate, should Mrs. Voss be declared incapacitated or deceased." Harrison blinked. "Excuse me." The clause was triggered, Sabine continued, when she was falsely declared dead in public. And when documents, signed without her consent, transferred authority illegally. Julia looked like she'd been slapped. "That clause was never filed in the estate records." "Correct," Sabine said. "It wasn't filed where you'd find it." Ben leaned forward. "So what? We're going to sit here and pretend Mother's pulling legal levers now? This is a joke." Eleanor turned to him. "Is it a joke to forge your mother's signature on the transfer of her personal trust account? Because I found the copy, Ben. Not the polished one you submitted. The first one. The draft with the watermark still on it." Ben went pale. Harrison stood. "Mother, if this is some kind of theatrical revenge, I suggest you." Sabine cut him off. "Sit down, Mr. Voss." And something about her voice, quiet but iron, made him obey. "The law will follow," Sabine said. "But this dinner is not about the courts. It's about giving your mother her final opportunity to speak freely, without being interrupted, without being managed." Eleanor rose slowly. She walked the length of the table, looking at each of them, the children she had carried, clothed, defended, and ultimately deceived herself about. "You think this house is yours," she said. "You think the Voss name belongs to your ambitions. You came here tonight expecting to inherit a corpse. But I am not dead, and neither is my will." She reached into her handbag and removed 3 sealed envelopes, one for each child. She placed them gently on their plates. Inside, she said, is the truth about what each of you has done. Financial records, letters, witnesses, and a choice. Ben's fingers twitched toward his envelope. Not yet, Eleanor said, voice cold. You'll read them after you leave. And after you read them, you will decide whether to walk away quietly or be dragged away by the scandal that will follow. Harrison's jaw clenched. You wouldn't dare. Eleanor finally smiled. I built this house, she said. And I will burn it down if that's what it takes to be heard. Silence. A long, dense silence. Then she turned, walked to her chair at the head of the table, and sat down calmly, regally, as if nothing had happened. Now, she said, picking up her napkin. Shall we eat? The roast had gone cold. None of them had eaten more than a few bites. The plates sat in eerie stillness, steam long since vanished, flavors forgotten beneath the tension that had sucked the air from the room. Julia was the first to leave. She rose without a word, her heels tapping a rhythm of defiance across the polished floor. She left her envelope untouched on the table. She'll read it in the car, Eleanor said softly, not looking up. She always needed an audience for her fury. Harrison stood next. He took his envelope, eyes never leaving his mother's face. You've made your point, he said. I'm not interested in making points, she replied, folding her hands neatly on her lap. Only in restoring balance. He didn't respond. His exit was quieter than Julia's, but not gentler. The slam of the front door echoed down the hall like the crack of a gunshot. Ben lingered. He stared at his envelope, picked it up, weighted in his palm as if it might explode. He met Eleanor's gaze briefly, then turned to Sabine. She helped you with all this? She helped me remember who I was, Eleanor said. Something you all worked very hard to erase. Ben nodded slowly. He didn't deny it. I never wanted to erase you, he said. Just move on from the shadows. Eleanor tilted her head. Then why build on my bones? Ben left the room without another word. Sabine waited until the footsteps faded, then approached the table and gathered the untouched silverware. Eleanor hadn't moved. You're shaking, Sabine said quietly. I'm furious, Eleanor answered. Which is different? Sabine placed a hand on her shoulder. It begins now. No, Eleanor said. It began the moment they forgot I was watching. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep in her old bedroom. She walked the halls of Waverly Hill like a sentinel, touching the spines of old books, glancing at the doors of rooms where lullabies once echoed and tantrums once shook the walls. Every corner of the house was haunted not by spirits, but by the versions of her children she used to love. In Julia's old room, the mirror was still cracked from the day she threw her jewelry box at it, angry that Eleanor had insisted she wear flats to a school recital. In Harrison's room, the shelves still held the first editions Eleanor had given him each birthday, each carefully selected, each long since forgotten. And Ben's, still scattered with old sketchbooks, half filled with ideas he abandoned the moment they got difficult. She stood in the doorway and felt the weight of failure. Not in her motherhood, but in her silence. They had mistaken her stillness for surrender. By morning, the battle had begun. Harrison's attorneys sent an inquiry to the family trust, demanding clarification of the unauthorized documentation presented at a private dinner. Julia's publicist posted a cryptic message about ungrateful matriarchs clinging to power they squandered. Ben, meanwhile, said nothing publicly, but his financial advisor left Eleanor a voicemail in the early afternoon, seeking clarification on discrepancies in recent account activity. Sabine and Eleanor listened to the message twice before Eleanor finally laughed. Like mice, she said. Scattering before the lights come on. Sabine glanced up from her notes. This will escalate. Once they realize how much is at stake. I'm counting on it, Eleanor said. They need to burn their reputations trying to kill me. That's the only way the world will believe I was worth silencing. Sabine folded her hands. Are you ready to go public? Eleanor turned to the window. Rain streaked down the glass, soft and steady. Not yet, she said. Let them sweat. Let them spin. Sabine nodded, rising to leave the room. Call me when you're ready to fire the first shot. Eleanor sat alone after she left, staring at the heavy envelope Harrison had left behind on the table. She hadn't touched it earlier. She had wanted them to open their own truths, but now curiosity crept in. She broke the seal. Inside, a copy of her medical file, heavily redacted, falsely signed, with notes she'd never approved. A psychological profile authored by a doctor she'd never met. One paragraph stood out. Subject exhibits erratic emotional behavior and has increasing difficulty distinguishing between past and present. She read it again and again. Then she lit a match from the candle in front of her and held the page over the flame. The fire rose quickly, devouring the lie. She watched the ashes fall into the silver tray. Now, she whispered to herself, let's see how well they handle the truth. It began with a whisper. A quiet piece in the Heathrow Gazette, buried halfway through the business section, under a vague but pointed headline, Waverly Legacy under legal review. No photos. No names. Just questions. A private legal dispute involving the sudden transition of ownership over a historic estate. A note about potential forgery. An unnamed matriarch, presumed unwell, now appearing in public again. It was careful. Surgical. Enough to stir curiosity without prompting lawsuits. But curiosity spreads like oil on fire when it's about the rich, the old, and the scandalous. By morning, 3 other outlets had picked up the scent. By afternoon, they were naming names. Julia's PR firm issued a firm but dignified statement claiming that Mrs. Voss was currently undergoing evaluation and receiving care. A photo of Julia attending an art auction the night before, smiling, unbothered, ran side by side with a stock photo of Waverly Hill, its iron gates shut. Harrison went the corporate route. Voss Holdings released a statement denying any irregularities in estate affairs and expressing full support for Mrs. Voss's recovery and continued privacy. Ben said nothing, but his silence was louder than their denials. And Eleanor? Eleanor opened her home. She invited the press. Not all of them, just one. A young journalist named Fiona Roth, who had once written a takedown of a pharmaceutical giant Eleanor admired. Fiona arrived skeptical, pen ready, prepared for exaggeration and melodrama. What she found was a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s, dressed in gray wool and pearls, sitting beside a roaring fireplace with copies of legal filings, financial statements, and forged documents arrayed on a table like chess pieces. I'm not interested in revenge, Eleanor told her. I'm interested in clarity. My children wrote my eulogy while I was still breathing. And now I'm going to let the world read the edits. Fiona stayed for 3 hours. 2 days later, the Herald ran a front-page exposé, not dead yet, inside the quiet war at Waverly Hill. The piece was devastating. It traced the timeline of the public betrayal. The power of attorney documents signed under dubious conditions. The gala that declared Eleanor dead without saying the words. The trust fund rerouted. The estate retitled. Eleanor's quiet reappearance and the sealed envelopes. But most damning of all was the testimony from Melba, the former housekeeper, who had come forward after reading the original story. They made me lie, Melba said. Said Mrs. Voss wasn't well. Told me to escort her out when she asked questions. She was sharp. They just didn't want her looking too closely. And, just like that, the narrative shifted. Eleanor wasn't the doddering matriarch clinging to power. She was the silenced woman who had risen from her social grave. The fallout came fast. Voss Holdings stock dipped for the first time in 3 years. Julia's gallery opening in Milan was quietly cancelled. Ben's name began trending online after Fiona's story revealed his forged transfer signature, accompanied by one damning quote from an anonymous source. Ben Voss couldn't spell fiduciary, let alone act in one. And the phone at Waverly Hill began ringing. Former allies, quiet doubters, even old friends. Some wanted to apologize. Others wanted to offer support, but Eleanor took none of the calls. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted silence, hers restored. Sabine sat beside her on the back porch that evening, watching the sun sink below the trees. "You've rattled them," she said. "I hope so. They'll retaliate. They always do." Sabine glanced over. "And when they do?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair. Her face looked older today, but not tired. Weathered, like stone made smooth by time and tide. "When they strike," she said, "I'll remind them, you don't kill a woman by burying her. You plant her." They sat in silence, the fireflies beginning to flicker in the dusk. And from inside the house, a new sound stirred, the low rumble of messages, calls, the rustling of a legacy fighting for breath. But Eleanor Voss was already breathing again. The siblings met in private, just as they always had when trouble brewed, but this time, there was no laughing. No soft music playing from Julia's phone. No platters of curated cheese and wine to distract them from the rot in their foundation. They gathered at Harrison's townhouse in the city, behind frosted glass windows and silk curtains, as if hiding from the world could still protect them. But the world had already seen through the veil. "Her face is everywhere," Julia snapped, tossing a newspaper across the marble countertop. "She looks like a bloody heroine in a BBC drama." Harrison didn't flinch. He hadn't flinched in days. His calm was cold now, surgical. He had lost enough bored confidence in the last week to make 3 of his partners demand a temporary resignation. "The court date is set. If we can delay it, control the media spin, and discredit Sabine. Julia scoffed. "She's practically a living saint to half the legal community. And you think this is just about court optics? You lied, Harrison. You had her declared medically unstable and didn't even consult a real doctor." He turned on her. "We agreed on that route. You didn't object when it meant we'd finally have full access." "I didn't know it would go this far." "Of course you did." They glared at each other. Ben, leaning against the fireplace, sighed. "This isn't the time to turn on each other. We still have time to what?" Julia cut in. "Salvage our reputations? Protect the money? Or crawl back to her and beg?" "No one is crawling," Harrison growled. Ben pulled a phone from his jacket pocket. "Then maybe you'll want to see this before it hits every feed in the country." He opened the screen and turned it to face them. A video. Eleanor, sitting in the library of Waverly Hill, speaking slowly and clearly to the camera. Her voice calm, her eyes sharp. "I was declared dead while I was still breathing. My wealth was stripped. My name erased. And I was turned into a story that served my children's ambition. But I am not gone, and this house, this name, was never theirs to rewrite. I have lived through silence. I will not die in it." The video was scheduled to premiere that night at 7 p.m. on 3 major networks and 6 digital platforms. Fiona Roth had coordinated it. Sabine had reviewed it line by line. And Eleanor had filmed it in one take. Julia stared at the screen, her face blanching. "She's going public. This public. She's torching everything," Harrison whispered. Ben stepped away from the fireplace and ran a hand down his face. "And she's already won the sympathy vote. You saw what they did to me online last week. I haven't been able to walk into a meeting without someone looking at me like I drowned a kitten." Harrison stood abruptly, pacing. "We need a counter-narrative. An interview. Something to paint this as a family dispute, not elder abuse." Julia crossed her arms. "It is elder abuse." That silenced the room. The truth, spoken plainly, sounded like thunder. Ben turned away, already pulling out his phone again. "I'll call Marston. We need crisis management. Today." Harrison's jaw clenched. But Julia just sat there, staring at the black screen of her phone. "She's going to ruin us," she whispered. "And you know what? Maybe we deserve it." Back at Waverly Hill, Eleanor stood in the library. The camera crew had packed up. Sabine was making tea. Fiona had left an hour ago, her voice shaking from the weight of what she had just witnessed. But Eleanor remained. The air in the house was still. Not silent, there was always sound at Waverly Hill. The creak of the wood, the sigh of the old walls, but still in that particular way that comes after a declaration. The kind of stillness before the world shifts beneath your feet. She placed her hands on the old piano. Julia's piano. She hadn't played it since she was 19. Eleanor had left it untouched since then. Dust had gathered over time until today. With one slow, careful stroke, she drew a line through the dust. Her home, her voice, her war, and now the world would hear it. The video would premiere in less than 2 hours. By morning, every major outlet would be buzzing. Eleanor Voss had not only survived, she had risen. The video shattered like glass across the digital world. Within 3 hours of release, it had racked up over 1 million views online. Major news outlets reshared it with commentary, social justice advocates praised it, legal analysts dissected it. #NotDeadYet trended by sundown, and by nightfall, Eleanor Voss became the unlikeliest icon of quiet resistance, a woman who had been betrayed, silenced, and discarded, now reclaiming her place, not with lawsuits or threats, but with unflinching truth. Inside Voss Holdings headquarters, the panic wasn't spoken aloud, but it oozed from every office, every urgent email thread, every canceled meeting. Shareholders demanded clarification. Board members called for an emergency session, and reporters began circling the financial irregularities buried in footnotes across recent filings. But the most dangerous fracture wasn't external. It was inside the Voss children themselves. Ben arrived first at Julia's apartment. He looked rough, eyes bloodshot, collar undone, his usual veneer of casual charm absent. He didn't wait to be offered wine or pleasantries. He dropped a thick folder onto her glass coffee table and collapsed into the armchair across from her. Julia eyed the folder with thinly veiled irritation. "I don't have time for another one of your long silences." Ben rubbed his face. "I'm out." She blinked. "Out." He nodded. "I called the foundation. I'm transferring my seat. All my board votes. I don't want any part of this anymore." Julia stood slowly. "You're just going to walk away?" "After all the years we spent." "We didn't spend them, Julia. We stole them." Her face twisted. "Oh, please. Don't pretend to grow a conscience just because Twitter's mad at you." Ben stood, pointing at the folder. "Read it. That's everything Sabine's team has on me. On you. On Harrison. If she files all that in court, we're not just going to lose the estate, we'll be publicly crucified." "You think she'll really do it?" She lit the match. "Now she's watching to see which of us runs." Julia didn't answer. Ben walked toward the door, but paused. "Do you remember when we used to sneak into her room at night?" When the thunder was bad, he asked softly. "She used to tell us that nothing outside could hurt us because she had the house wrapped around us like arms." Julia's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Ben nodded to himself and walked out the door. Eleanor stood at the top of the stairs in Waverly Hill that night, looking down over the vast, candlelit foyer. The house felt different now. Not reclaimed, exactly, but alert. As if the very walls had leaned forward to listen. Sabine entered from the study, a laptop in her hands. "You should see this," she said. Eleanor followed her into the drawing room, where Sabine set the laptop on the table. The screen was paused on a message, an internal Voss Holdings memo. It had been leaked anonymously. Eleanor read it slowly. And then again. Julia and Harrison were blaming each other, throwing accusations like knives. Julia claimed Harrison manipulated documents behind her back. Harrison insisted Julia coerced Melba into silence and falsified financial projections to discredit their mother. Both statements were now part of a leaked internal review. Eleanor smiled faintly. "They're turning on each other." "They were never together," Sabine said. "Just aligned by ambition." Eleanor stepped back from the screen and looked out the window. Ben was the first to flinch. He'll be the first to run. Julia will dig her heels in, but she's brittle. Harrison, he'll be the last to fall. He always saw himself as king. Sabine studied her. Do you want them to fall, Eleanor? Eleanor didn't answer for a long time. I want the truth, she finally said. Whatever that burns down along the way is on them. Sabine closed the laptop. Then it's time for the final move. Eleanor turned toward her. Call the trustees, she said. It's time they heard from the woman who was supposed to be dead. The sun rose over Waverly Hill as if nothing had changed. Its rays warmed the ivy-covered brick and kissed the empty fountains below, scattering through dusty windows like the house itself was remembering how to breathe. But inside, Eleanor Voss was already awake. She hadn't slept. Not because of nerves, but because her mind had become too sharp, too alive. Sabine had spent the previous evening compiling the evidence, documents, witness statements, digital forensics, from Eleanor's ledger and their weeks of research. Every piece of the children's betrayal was ready to be handed to the estate's independent trustees. It would be enough. Legally. Publicly. But something didn't sit right in Eleanor's bones. There was still something missing. And she didn't know what it was, only that it tugged at her, softly, like a thread caught in a floorboard. Something left unfinished. Unspoken. Buried deeper than betrayal. That's why, after Sabine left to deliver the documents to the trustees, Eleanor found herself descending into the cellar. She hadn't set foot down there in years. The steps creaked with memory. The air turned colder. Waverly Hill's cellar wasn't meant for guests. It was a place of storage, of archives and decay. The light bulbs flickered weakly overhead as she walked past old trunks, wine crates, forgotten furniture under dusty sheets. She was looking for her husband's ledgers. Not the public ones, those had been digitized years ago. These were the personal books. The journals he kept in the early years, when the estate was first rebuilt after their marriage. She'd seen him hide them once, before they were married. Before he learned how to lie with a straight face. She reached the far wall. There, beneath the wooden staircase, behind a false panel of stone that even time had forgotten, she found them. 3 black-bound ledgers. She took the top one, brushed away the dust, and sat on an old trunk. Her hands trembled, not from age, but from something deeper. Anticipation. Dread. The entries were businesslike at first. Construction costs, staff salaries, acquisition notes. Then came the notes about her father-in-law's will, the Voss Holdings charter, and finally, deep in the final pages, entries about Eleanor herself. And then, one entry. A page Thomas had marked in red ink. The house is no longer in her name. She thinks it is. She signed the transfer thinking it was a security clause. I changed it. Needed to. For the trust. For the board. She'll never know. She trusts me too much. Eleanor froze. Her blood ran cold. She read the entry again. And again. The paper didn't change. The words didn't vanish. Her own husband, Thomas Voss, had taken the house from her. Quietly. Years before her children ever touched the papers. He had manipulated her signature, rerouted the ownership, and built the current estate charter around a lie. He had built the foundation of their fortune, not just on strategy or ambition, but on her ignorance. Her children hadn't begun the betrayal. They had inherited it. And suddenly, she saw it all differently. Harrison, cold and sharp. Julia, desperate to control perception. Ben, aimless and angry. They hadn't fallen from grace. They had been born in the shadow of it. The enemy hadn't been them alone. It had started with Thomas. And she had helped him, trusted him, loved him. She sat in the darkness, the ledger heavy on her lap. The house was never hers, not in the eyes of the law. She had never owned Waverly Hill, not once. 2 hours later, Sabine returned, papers signed, evidence delivered. She found Eleanor still in the cellar. You look like you've seen a ghost, Sabine said. I have, Eleanor whispered. And his name was Thomas. She handed her the ledger. Sabine read the red-inked entry, her eyes narrowing. This changes the foundation of everything. Eleanor nodded, but not the outcome. Sabine looked up. What do you mean? I'm not fighting for property anymore, Eleanor said. I'm not fighting for legacy. I'm fighting for the truth to finally be louder than the lie. Sabine closed the book. Then we adjust the plan, she said. No, Eleanor said, standing tall. We keep it, but we include everything, even this. They tried to erase me from my own story. She looked back toward the staircase. I won't leave this world as a footnote. The press gathered at the gates of Waverly Hill before sunrise. The estate hadn't seen this much attention since the Foundation's centennial gala a decade ago, the same gala where Eleanor had been ushered offstage like a prop. But today, it was different. Today, she was not a symbol. She was the story. Camera crews set up beneath the iron arches. Microphones angled toward the grand front doors. Reporters murmured into earpieces. Drones hovered like vultures above the treetops. And inside, Eleanor Voss stood before a mirror, dressed in the same gray-blue suit she wore the day she gave the eulogy at her husband's funeral. It was simple, sharp, undeniable. Her hair was pinned. Her hands were steady. The truth sat in her chest like a fire that would not die. Sabine stood nearby, her phone vibrating endlessly with updates. They're all watching, she said. Julia's team issued a rebuttal. Harrison tried to leak false documents, but Fiona's already published a correction with proof of forgery. Then, disappeared. Eleanor nodded. Let them talk. I'm done whispering. Outside, the estate doors opened with a groan of old hinges. Eleanor stepped into the light. The crowd hushed. Flashbulbs flickered. And then she spoke, not from behind a podium, not with speechwriters or legalese, but from her memory, her heartbreak, and her reckoning. I stand here today, she began, as a woman who was buried before her body failed, and silenced before her voice wavered. I was written out of my story, not by strangers, but by those I loved most. She held up one of the ledgers, its cracked spine visible to the cameras. This is my husband's handwriting. In it, he admits to altering our estate charter without my knowledge. He transferred Waverly Hill from my name before I ever knew it was mine to lose. Gasps echoed through the crowd. I did not raise monsters, but I raised children in the shadow of one. My silence taught them how to sharpen deception into survival. I take responsibility for that. She turned slightly, her voice growing sharper. Harrison, Julia, Ben, if you're watching this, I am not asking for restitution. I am not asking for apologies. I am demanding something far more terrifying to people like you. She held up a sealed letter. This is a formal offer, a relinquishment agreement. I will forego all claims to the estate, to the company, and to the Voss fortune on one condition. A beat of silence passed. You each must sign a public confession acknowledging your roles in the deceit that nearly destroyed me. You must admit that you manipulated legal channels to take my name, my property, and my freedom. And you must step down publicly, permanently, from any governing body associated with the Voss legacy. Reporters gasped. Cameras zoomed in. If you do not sign within 48 hours, Eleanor continued, the full contents of these ledgers will be published. Every page, every betrayal, from Thomas's lies to your forgeries. Every private account, every falsified signature. Not to punish you, but to make sure the world knows who built their empires on a lie. She paused then. Let the silence settle. I am not asking to be queen again. I am asking to be known. With that, she stepped back and let Sabine distribute copies of the letter to each reporter present. She didn't take questions. She didn't wait to see the reactions. She turned and walked back into the house. Inside, the old grandfather clock chimed. Sabine followed her into the drawing room. Do you think they'll sign? Eleanor sat slowly, her back straight. No. Then why give them the option? Eleanor looked toward the staircase, her voice quiet now. Because I wanted to be sure that I was better than them. The world reacted fast. Commentators called it a masterclass in quiet vengeance. Scholars began citing her case as an example of elder exploitation in law lectures. Women from all over the country began sending letters to Waverly Hill, hundreds of them. Stories of similar betrayals, of being erased, discarded, belittled. But as the hours ticked by, there was no response from the Voss children. Until, on the second night, a black car pulled up the long drive. The gates creaked open, and one figure stepped out. It wasn't Harrison. It wasn't Julia. It was Ben. And in his hand, he held the signed confession. He didn't knock. He just stood in the open archway, shoulders hunched in a way Eleanor hadn't seen since he was 16, the year Thomas raised his voice and Ben learned to stop dreaming out loud. The boy in him was still there, buried beneath expensive fabric and years of wrong turns, but his eyes, when they met hers, were unguarded. Ben took a step inside. The confession was in his left hand. The envelope crinkled slightly as his fingers clenched around it. His other hand remained buried in his coat pocket, as if he needed the weight of something else, something real, to keep him grounded. Eleanor didn't rise. She sat on the velvet settee beside the hearth, her hands folded neatly, her expression unreadable. "Only you?" she asked. He nodded. "They won't sign," he said. "Harrison's hired 2 crisis firms and a former senator. Julia's flying to Zurich. And you?" Ben looked down at the envelope. "I read every word of the ledger," he said. "I didn't know what he did to you. I thought we were the beginning of the rot. But he set the mold. We just grew in it." His voice cracked, but he didn't cry. "I don't expect forgiveness," he added. "I just wanted to give you this in person. No lawyers. No cameras." He walked forward, slowly, and placed the envelope on the table in front of her. Signed. Witnessed. Public. Final. Eleanor stared at it, then at him. "You betrayed me," she said. Laughed as they pushed me aside. Sat at my table. Ate my food. Spoke at my funeral before I was cold. Ben closed his eyes. "I know. You will never touch the family trust again. You will never step foot on company property. Your name, your access, your claim, stripped." He nodded. "That's fair." Eleanor's voice grew quieter. "But you came back." A silence passed between them, the kind of silence that doesn't beg for noise. Finally, she rose, walked past the table, and stood in front of him. And without another word, she reached up and touched his face. It was not affection. It was recognition. "You may stay the night," she said. "But tomorrow you leave. No press. No posts. No pity." Ben nodded once more. And for the first time in years, Eleanor saw the boy who once brought her tea on rainy days, who painted birds in the garden, who once whispered to her at 6 years old, "Promise you'll never die." And though the ache in her chest begged her to soften, she turned away. She was not the mother of that boy anymore. She was the woman who survived them all. Outside, the media waited. Inside, Eleanor returned to the drawing room and picked up the confession. 1 down, 2 to go. But she no longer needed the others. Not to reclaim the house. Not to restore the name. Not to rise. She had done all that already. What remained was legacy, and she would write that herself. Waverly Hill had always been a house of shadows. Even at its brightest, beneath spring sunlight or the glimmer of chandeliered evenings, there had always been corners the light didn't touch. But now, for the first time in decades, the light poured into every room, unafraid, unapologetic, just like her. Eleanor stood at the far edge of the garden as workmen placed the final stone into the curved wall facing the sea. The fountain had long been dry, and for years it had served as nothing more than a backdrop for family photos. But now it bore something new. Her name. Not in cursive. Not in the delicate font of the family crest. But carved deep and even into granite. The Eleanor Voss Foundation for Truth and Legacy the Stone would mark the beginning of the estate's transformation. She was converting half of Waverly Hill into a trust-protected cultural archive, open to women who had been erased, histories suppressed, names omitted, voices silenced. The rest would remain private, protected by the clause Sabine refiled in her name just 3 days ago. No child, no board, no heir could touch it now. It belonged to the story. It belonged to her. Inside, Fiona Roth was finishing her final interview with Sabine for an exclusive piece. A book deal was already in motion. Not a tell-all. Not a scandal rag. A testament. A warning. A fire lit slowly. Ben had left quietly that morning. True to his word. He left a sketch in her study, an ink drawing of Waverly Hill as it once looked, before the new renovations. On the back, in tiny script, just 4 words: "Thank you for staying." She had folded it into a drawer. That was all it needed to be. Julia and Harrison never responded to the public confession demand, and they never would. In their circles, silence was safer than surrender. But Eleanor didn't need them to fall anymore. She only needed to rise. And she had. Later that evening, she stood in the main hall alone. She ran her hand along the marble railing, each step a memory. The gala. The betrayal. The voice she'd nearly lost. And then, further back, laughter. Music. A younger woman in a gown, dancing with her husband, unaware that even love can lie. She entered the library and opened the window. The ocean wind rushed in, full of salt and silence. And then she lit a single match. Not for destruction. For ritual. She held it to the edge of a final letter, not her children's, but Thomas's, found tucked behind the ledger she'd discovered in the cellar. A letter never sent. A confession never spoken. "I did it for them," it read. "For the name. You'll forgive me someday." As the flames licked the paper, Eleanor watched it curl and blacken. The past didn't deserve to survive if it lived in lies. She let the ashes fall into the tray. Then she turned to her desk and opened a new page. At the top, she wrote, "Let this be the beginning not of what I lost, but of everything I finally claimed." And so it was. Eleanor Voss, the woman erased, became the woman remembered. Not as a victim, but as the author of her own last chapter. Here the story ends. Thanks for watching. Hit like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more true and real stories.